The 9th day of World War II brought revelations that history books barely whisper about. September 9, 1939. While the world watched Poland's agony unfold, shadows moved in corridors of power where decisions were made that would reshape civilization itself. In Warsaw, something extraordinary happened that morning. A Polish cryptographer named Jan walked into a building that no longer exists, carrying documents that would never officially be recorded. Inside were the final pieces of the Enigma puzzle, mathematical formulas scrawled on paper that was already turning yellow with age. The Germans believed their codes were unbreakable. They were wrong. But this knowledge came at a price nobody talks about. Jan never made it out of Warsaw. His name appears in no memorial. His sacrifice bought time measured in lives saved, yet history forgot him completely. Across the border, in a small German town whose name has been erased from maps, something darker unfolded. The first unofficial ghetto wasn't created in Poland. It happened on German soil, in a place where Jewish families had lived for generations. On day 9, local authorities began what they called voluntary relocation. 73 families were given 2 hours, not the organized deportations that would come later. This was improvised cruelty, a test run nobody documented officially. The residents of that town watched their neighbors dragged from homes. Some helped, most looked away. By evening, an entire community had vanished into a converted warehouse. No records were kept. No photographs survived. Only whispered stories passed through generations of survivors who eventually scattered across continents. Meanwhile, in London, a meeting took place in a basement beneath Whitehall. 6 men sat around a table making calculations that would determine who lived and who died. They weren't discussing military strategy. They were deciding food rationing quotas, and the mathematics were brutal. The numbers showed clearly that Britain couldn't feed everyone if shipping lanes were cut. Someone would have to starve. The elderly, children, the working class. For 3 hours they debated which citizens were expendable. Minutes from this meeting were classified for 80 years. When finally released, most pages had been redacted. What remains shows only that decisions were made, not what those decisions were. In the Atlantic Ocean, a British merchant vessel called the Aramis encountered a German U-boat. What happened next defies the narrative we've been taught. The submarine surfaced. The captain, a man named Klaus Müller, allowed the British crew to abandon ship before sinking their vessel. Then something unprecedented occurred. Müller provided the British sailors with coordinates to the nearest shipping lane and extra rations. He radioed their position to British ships, risking his own mission. Why? His personal diary, discovered decades later in an attic in Hamburg, reveals he'd been a merchant sailor himself before the war. He couldn't watch men drown. This single act of humanity happened on day 9, and Müller paid for it. 2 weeks later, he was relieved of command, not for military failure, but for insufficient commitment to the cause. He spent the rest of the war at a desk in Berlin, filing reports. He saved 23 British sailors and destroyed his own career. Nobody remembers his name. In France, the government was already planning its surrender, though publicly they pledged support for Poland. Documents discovered in 2003 show that on September 9th, French military leadership had already drafted preliminary terms for a potential armistice with Germany. This was day 9. Poland was still fighting. Britain had just entered the war, yet France's generals were already calculating defeat. These documents remained hidden in private archives, protected by families who knew their revelation would destroy reputations built on myths of resistance. Back in Poland, in a village called Kamieńsk, a Catholic priest named Father Wojciech hid 17 Jewish children in his church basement. Not later in the war, when such stories became almost common. On day 9, he'd known these families his entire life. When the German forces approached, he made a choice that contradicted everything his superiors would later claim about the church's position during those early days. He kept those children hidden for 8 months, feeding them from his own rations, teaching them in secret. 16 survived the war. None of them ever spoke publicly about it, respecting his request for silence. He feared not German retribution, but the judgment of his own church hierarchy. Father Wojciech died in 1967, and only at his funeral did the truth emerge, whispered among elderly congregants who'd kept his secret for decades. The 9th day of World War II wasn't about grand battles or famous speeches. It was about choices made in shadows, humanity flickering in darkness, and cruelty taking its first experimental steps. These moments shaped the war as much as any tank division or aerial bombardment. Yet we don't talk about them because they complicate the narrative, blur the lines we've drawn between heroes and villains, and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature when civilization begins to collapse.